And you're tuned in to Questions and Answers with Andrew Carlson and myself. Are you ready for a question?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. This comes from Steph Lynn. Is it possible to witness the prophecies of Daniel and the book of Revelations slowly coming to fruition in the modern world?
I already know Jackson's answer on this.
You bet you do.
So let's hear it.
My answer is no. These are not prophecies. They're called apocalypses. And what they do in what is that noise? What they do in cryptic language is tell the story of what's going on at the time they were written. It's in cryptic language because if they would tell the story outrightly, their enemies would take those copies of the manuscripts and destroy them, and then hunt down whoever wrote them and have them killed. So they write them cryptically using prophetic words and incidences from the Old Testament primarily to encrypt the story of their current history. So only Jews, especially those in the dispersion, could read and understand what was going on in Israel at that time. And there's plenty of proof of this. I won't go into that right now, but I will go to just one chapter, if you don't mind. I'm going to go to Revelation 1 and show you just a couple verses there that we can do the same with the whole book. The revelation of Yeshua HaMashiach, which Elohim gave him to show his servants, actually slaves, the things that must soon take place. Not take place thousands of years from now. Soon take place. In the Olivet Discourse in Matthew chapter 24, Yeshua predicts the entire happenings to Israel during the Jewish war, and he says that this generation will not pass before these things happen. In another place, he says, those who are alive today in this generation will live to see it all. So he prophesied sometime around 30 AD regarding the temple and its stones falling down, and exactly one prophetic generation passed before it happened, 40 years on the button. So let's go on here just for a minute. I'm not going to take long with this. We go down, I think, to verse 7. Behold, he is coming with clouds, and every eye will see him, even those who pierced him. And all the tribes of the earth will wail on account of him. Okay, so how in the world are those who pierced him going to see him if they're dead? How are they going to see them? So this is another place where we are assured that this is of the history of 40 years from when Yeshua prophesied in the time of John, the Revelator. And he tells us that in verse 9, John, your brother and partner in the tribulation and the kingdom, and now the patient endurance. He was on the Isle of Patmos on account of two things, two witnesses, the word of Elohim and the witness of Yeshua. It says, I was in the spirit on the Lord's day. That's Kurakai, which actually means, speaking of Yahweh, Yahweh's day. The day of the Lord is prophesied all through the Old Testament prophets as a day of gloom, a day of red moons, a day of destruction, the end of Jerusalem, the wrath of Elohim coming down on Israel, prophesied clear through. And what John is proclaiming is that he's in the Spirit on that day, and that day was happening in his life at that very time. Again, remember, he writes to Jews in the dispersion. Now, not to go much farther, just to say that if you read Revelation right along with the Jewish War by Josephus, only a caveman couldn't see that Revelation is the history of that time. But if he had written this in plain language, he would be hunted down as the author of seditious material and killed, and his letter would be collected all over the world. People would be threatened for their life if they had one, and they would be burned. Now you can find throughout Revelation the same saying in regards to when. That is, I am coming soon, or this is going to happen soon. I can't quite think of it right now. There's more in this one chapter as well. And he's talking in the next two chapters to 7 assemblies at that time. And there's no place where it says this is thousands of years to come. The things that happen in Revelation, with the exception of those things that happen in the heaven or in the mid-heavens, that couldn't be seen, although some of them were seen by Josephus. Those things were happening then. There are many good commentaries that will show you step by step how this works. One of the best is by our friend Adam, and it's called The Mystery is History, which you can get from me free of charge. He's given me permission, since I wrote the prologue on it, to send out PDF copies of this. He's very, very thorough with it as well. There's another one called Back to the Future by Ray Bass, a Presbyterian, who takes it step by step through Revelation to show how all those things happened. Of course, with the exception of what couldn't be seen. Throne room scenes, for instance, couldn't be seen. And there you have it. There's no reason to be fearful anymore. Revelation has been, and Daniel, have been wonderful money makers for Christians now for 2,000 years. As long as they can keep it in the future, they can still turn coin on it. Now, these evangelists, internet pastors, and doomsayers, they all know the truth. They all know the truth, but they've got to keep the lie alive in order to continue to threaten you with future happenings that are terrible and horrifying, and to threaten the country here with judgment of the 10 plagues coming down on us now. And you've heard that. I know you have. But why would Elohim want to send plagues on this country, since this country is the most righteous in the entire world? Why are they not sending plagues down on Japan or on China or on Antarctica? Why do they not prophesy those things? Because they know they've got no leverage with you if you know the truth. Also, people are saying, well, look, this is happening today, like chapter 12. No, the people running, the children running into the wilderness and hiding for fear. Now I forgot what I was going to say, because I'm thinking of this strawberry I have here. You want to see it?
Let's see it.
Look at this strawberry. That's one giant strawberry. Like it?
I can't tell how big it is because you have it right up to the camera.
I know. I'd have to turn off this other thing. There. That's pretty big.
Yeah.
Maybe it wasn't a fig leaf. Maybe it was a big strawberry from Adam and Eve. Yes, they are good too. That's what I'm eating for snacks these days. And I guess I'm done there. But with Daniel, it's exactly the same thing. It's the history there of the time of Antiochus Epiphanes and what's going on. In fact, he's the little horn. Even your study Bible will tell you that. Is that good enough?
Yeah, so let me give my take on it.
All right.
So, of course, I often take the alternate position to Jackson, but what I can say is, a long time ago, I tended to interpret Old Testament prophecy as future happening, and I do think that was a lot of that was from my Protestant upbringing. But so as I studied scripture, I came to understand that the important context indicates that in a large number of the prophecies, they've already been fulfilled because they were intended for that specific time period. Like certain things in Ezekiel and Jeremiah were very much focused in those days and not for a future time. Whereas in the past, I used to think it was for a future time, but I've since understood otherwise. Now, for Revelation and Daniel, I think we also need to apply that context to it. And so in much of both books, I think it is, in fact, historical in the past. But there are certain things in both books, but especially Revelation, which I find do not really have a valid fulfillment in ancient times. So that would lead us to one of two conclusions. Either the book is false prophecy, or these things may in fact still be fulfilled in a future time.
How deeply have you studied that, Oni?
What, Revelation?
Yeah.
Well, I'm just saying there's certain prophecies like the resurrection of the dead and no more death and things like that that I don't see as being fulfilled in our current world.
It may have been fulfilled in the past, but I understand what you're saying because a lot of people can't see that in the time frame. I think Revelation and those types of things, instead of having a horizontal timeline like we do, you turn the whole timeline vertically, because in multidimensionality, everything happens at the same time. I believe that the millennium is going on right now, and I believe that the destruction of Jerusalem is still going on right now in a multidimensional timeline. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Well, if that's the case, then the future has happened in the past, and so it is future.
I would agree with you on that.
But let me also say this, that I think that if you look at historically at the interpretation of Revelation specifically, we find that in the early church period, there was a heavy emphasis on a literal millennium of a physical nature where there would be a renewal to people living much longer lives. Kind of like what Isaiah says, where Isaiah says if they die at 100, they'll be considered young when they die. And so this was the predominant interpretation in the early church of the first few centuries. I believe you can find good evidence that the apostles shared this interpretation of a literal kingdom on earth, a physical kingdom that was to be established eventually by the Messiah himself at a future time. And it may be the case that the apostles believed that that kingdom would be set up in their lifetimes. And of course, that did not happen.
It did.
Not
my way of thinking. But
yeah, but that's not much of a kingdom if it's...
It's an unseen kingdom. We can't see it yet because we're not delivered into it yet. But I have another question for you that now is burning on my mind, and I know I'll forget it in 2 minutes.
All right, so let's hear it.
I would like to know your interpretation of the war scroll, which I know that you are predicting that for the future. I've heard it a couple of times, but I like to hear it once again. I think it's pertinent to the question. You don't think
Sure.
that's an apocalypse, and you don't think that it's necessarily directives for the zealots to fight during the Jewish wars, plural. In the future, I'd like to hear it more.
So it's very specific instructions of how to fight this particular war. Now, much of it seems to be very good rules for how to fight war in general. It talks about the priests going along, waving the banners and all these type of things, the blessings of the priests. All that could be applicable to any war. But then it goes into very specific details about this particular war, which is supposed to last 40 years. And it talks about all these kind of details, how the different maneuvers they're supposed to fight in, and how long they'll be fighting each group of sons of Noah. So for basically 10 years, they'll be fighting everybody.
The Kittim, is that in there?
The Kittim, yeah. 10 years they'll be fighting the sons of Japheth, which is basically Europeans. 10 years they'll be fighting the sons of Africa. So that's the sons of Ham, which is Africa. And then the sons of Shem, which is Asia, essentially, will be fought for a 10-year period. And it gives the instructions of who is being fought in which years, and in the different commands of how they are to fight.
There's like seven battle plans in there.
I think it's the final battles, the final, like near the very end.
The final 7 battles.
Yeah.
Yeah. I like this. Tell us more.
So there's a couple possibilities with this war scroll. One, it's a very ancient prophecy that was prophesied by one of the prophets, unknown who that would be. Because in the Law of Moses, it mentions a book of the wars of the Lord. So that could possibly be the war scroll. But the second interpretation, which to me seems more likely, so if that's the case, perhaps a scribe interpolated the reference into the Torah, because that would have to be the case if it was referencing a book that was written way later. Then it would have to be added. It would have had to have been added later by a scribe. So I lean more towards that interpretation, where the war scroll was a document prophesied by the Essenes, because there's a lot of language in there that seems to be sectarian. And of course, that term is used by scholars to refer to the group of Qumran, which they had a distinct style when they were writing their own writings. Now, some scholars assert that, for example, some of the other Apocrypha texts in the Dead Sea Scrolls are sectarian documents, but I think that's not a strong evidence. For example, they often identify the Thanksgiving hymns as sectarian, but I would have to disagree with that.
I agree with you. Definitely, you're right.
I think they're pre-Qumran, and then the sectarians, as people call them, took those hymns and then emulated those hymns, emulated the language of those hymns, and took that language upon themselves to use it for sectarian purposes. So, all that to say, that's the second interpretation, where it is a prophecy. And then with both those interpretations, if it's a prophecy, then there's a few options. One, this was a war that has already happened. There doesn't seem to be any evidence currently that this war was ever fought. So the second alternative is this was a if scenario, where kind of like Jonah, where he prophesied 40 days, it didn't happen, but it was a conditional prophecy. So that could be, that's another alternative, that this was these were rules given in case of a worst case scenario for them to be prepared. That I find to be a weak interpretation due to the nature of the content. It seems very much that it's intended as a very important book and not just a hypothetical war that will never happen.
So is this the war where the Malachim, righteous Malachim, come down and fight these battles with the sectarians?
I think the angels come in to save the day at the very end. I don't think they're fighting alongside with them in the earlier portions.
How could the sectarians think, with the limited number that they had, that they could defeat all these enemies at that time? It's got to be prophetic in some sense. Can't be at that time unless it could possibly be in 135 AD, because we don't have a lot of intelligence on what happened in the second revolt. We don't know much about that one. Is that a possibility?
So one possibility, of course, is that it's just false prophecy and it isn't authentic. But it's certainly, let's say in the context of it being false prophecy or prediction, they didn't necessarily think that it had to be sectarians that would fight this war. I think they were open to the possibility of fighting alongside other groups of people. I mean, you do see that in Josephus's account, the Essenes fought right alongside the Pharisees and the Sadducees too, if I'm not mistaken, but I don't know for sure. But I know definitely the Pharisees and Essenes fought alongside each other in those wars. So certainly I think they understood it to be a nationwide conflict, that the people of Israel would come together and fight for the sake of the nation. Kind of similar to the whole Maccabee story, where the Maccabees saved the day, even though in the beginning they were small numbers, but they kept growing and growing. So the interpretation I go with is that it is a future time and it will still be fulfilled, but there are a couple problems with this. One, of course, is that it describes very archaic fighting methods, which is hard to believe could happen, because it talks about horses, javelins. I'm not sure if it talks about arrows or not, but it uses that type of language, very ancient military words. So either Israel's going to start using those again, but that would seem unlikely, although it is not impossible, but it is unlikely. The only thing that could make that happen is if there was like a complete wipeout of a lot of our technology and we had to revert back to times with much less technology. But the second possibility is that what do you call something that you don't have a word for in ancient times? What was the word in Hebrew for horse? It might have been something along the lines of swift. I don't know if that's what it means, but each word in Hebrew for an animal actually meant something. It was a character description. So let's just say hypothetically, horse meant swift. So they saw this prophecy of the future and they're like, well, these are swift like horses. And so they use these words because it's a symbolic of what they're seeing. And I mean, we do talk about with cars and how the speed of cars is a certain horsepower. So that's kind of an interesting language thing there. But so I would say that it is going to be fulfilled, but how exactly it will be fulfilled is not clear. And it's also possible, even if it was false prophecy, this war still might happen, even if it's false prophecy. And that's because it seems like Israel as a nation really reveres this book. They have a shrine in honor of this book, War Scroll. shrine of the sons of darkness against the sons of light. And it's there. And so all it would take is a radical group of Israelites coming into power, believing the war score is valid, and deciding to start this war. It wouldn't be necessarily the other nations that started. Israel themselves could decide to start this war to make this prophecy come to pass. And probably the primary catalyst for this happening, I believe, will be the construction of the third temple. If and when, I believe it will happen, but if and when it does happen, when the third temple is built, they have to tear down the Dome of the Rock. When that happens, all hell's going to break loose, because all Muslims, which is basically, a good chunk of Asia, Muslims are very much in support of the Dome of the Rock. So if that goes away, they will want to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. Secondly, Europeans as well, pretty much every Western nation, including America, increasingly so, is more and more becoming anti-Israel and pro-Palestinian. So if they were to tear down the Dome of the Rock and put the temple up, that would start an international crisis where they would pretty much all nations would condemn Israel for doing that. And they might want to attack Israel or do sanctions against Israel to try to punish them. And when that happens, I believe Israel will retaliate, defend themselves, and also do the offensive and attack other nations to protect their belief that they have the right to that land, as well as building the temple. So I definitely think that war is going to happen. And the temple will be built. Whether or not it's approved by Yah is a different story. I believe it will be, but people differ on that. But whether or not it's going to be approved, I'm very confident it will come to pass, that it will be constructed.
The temple, they didn't get the Dome of the Rock over the Holy of Holies. The Holy of Holies is beneath the little shrine of the, can't remember, but I've been there. I've stood right over the Holy of Holies. So what the big plan was in the late 80s, to build that temple on the same place as the Holy of Holies, that they figured there was room there and that they could put the Kadosh, the holy place, right over where that shrine was. That would be the only thing they would have to take out of it. A shrine of it's just a little round cement kind of thing that's sticking up. And that both of these would fit on there. Now, that there was a lot of press about this, and I was there in '88 with a group, and the Muslims were shooting at us. The sniper was shooting right at us. They didn't hit us, of course, and I don't think they meant to, but we saw the bullets hitting the ground around us. And at that very time, the plan to put it on that spot was happening. In fact, the head of the temple faithful, I'm not recalling his name right now, I think he's dead. They brought the cornerstone to the Temple Mount. They got that far with it before the Muslims that guard the place were able to get them out, and there was a riot going on at that same time when we were there. Of course, the Temple Mount faithful were not able to get that cornerstone up there. And I believe they've tried that at some other times, though. And just one more note, I think I mentioned this before. Robert Eisenman talks about his brother, who is a very famous Jewish architect that is in the running to design that third temple, if it should happen anytime soon. But he's getting elderly now. I think that Peter Eisenman's in his mid-80s. So either he's already put together the architectural plan for this third temple, and it's already in the works, or maybe they wouldn't use him if he died and this happened. But all through the last 50 years, they have been collecting all the gold accoutrements for the temple, which you can see online if you want to go look around for it. The lavers, the incense carrying things, some made of bronze, some made of gold. The mercy seat has already been built, and these things are being stored. They're all ready to go. They're just waiting for the chance to get up there and get the thing rolling. The plan with the two temples on that mount never went through because, of course, the Muslims didn't like it and the Jews didn't like it. But it's the only thing close, I think, Oni, to a solution to the problem of where to put the temple. I believe like you, except I hope that it's never built because of that very thing. That would be a war to beat all wars, probably. If you got the whole Asia coming against Israel, they couldn't possibly win unless at the end the angels came down actually and took care of the situation like that. So that's one of the reasons I was interested in your scheme for that. And I'm wondering, do you have an estimated time that might happen?
I believe, of course, this is somewhat speculation, but It's based on my belief of the 7,000-year theory. I'm inclined to think that what's going to happen is that a temple will be built, followed by a 40-year war. After the 40-year war, then the Antichrist comes onto the scene, and that's when all the final stuff happens.
Where does it say that the Antichrist comes on the scene anyplace?
There are apocryphal documents.
Oh, I know there are, but I'm thinking of the more...
Not in the war. It doesn't say in the war scroll about an Antichrist. I'm just putting the pieces together. And the way I see it is this war is going to happen, followed by the time of Jacob's trouble. And then, what book does that phrase come from? Time of Jacob's trouble?
Beats me.
Because I might be using that phrase ahistorically. But basically, I think, so based on that understanding, I think that war will be around 2120, like roughly. So 2020 was a horrible year, where 2120 is going to be really, really crazy. And it's going to be a 40-year war. That's my prediction. So it's a long time from now.
Oh, that quote is from Jeremiah 37.
Okay.
Trouble thing.
So yeah, that's definitely
FYI. Well, I think that's a really interesting concept, to tell you the truth. I just had to reject it out of hand at the time, but then I looked into the war scroll, read it through again. I thought, hey, well, it's possible that this could be actual prophecy we're seeing here. And it's not so hard to imagine that technology will fail. It's not hard to imagine. One EMP put in the right place could shut us down completely. All right.
Yeah. I did want to also say what I was saying earlier was that the early church had this interpretation of a not a secret unseen kingdom, but a physical kingdom that was plain to everyone who could see, that is established by force, and that there will be a time of, how Papias and Irenaeus speak of the plentiful fruit the vines, 1,000 branches, or whatever, bunches. And that was the predominant interpretation for the first few centuries. And then you come around the scene when the Roman Catholic Church comes into major power after Constantine. And within a century after that, it basically becomes official church position that it's allegorical, not literal. The church is the new Israel. The church is the fulfillment of all these prophecies, and these prophecies have been fulfilled. There's no more future for Israel. So I believe that the understanding of all these things have already been fulfilled very much goes towards the anti-Israel perspective. I think that there are some prophecies that, for the sake of Israel being important and his true holy people, like the scriptures speak of in the Old Testament times, there needs to be some of these prophecies to be fulfilled in the future. Otherwise, Israel is completely unimportant in our time for the last 2,000 years. It doesn't make sense. But if there is still a future plan for Israel, then some prophecies, not all, but some prophecies may still come to pass for Israel's restoration. And there were prophecies that spoke of Israel existing in the last days, it seems, and Israel has come back. And there is this push for this third temple, and there are prophecies that seem to indicate that there will be a future time of sacrifices that will happen. So this would be very much in line with a restoration of Israel. And Paul speaks of how the fullness of the Gentiles comes in first, and then after the fullness of the Gentiles, then it will come back to Israel, and Israel's glory will fully come back. And however that happens, I believe that has to happen for the sake of Israel. If Israel will never be restored to its former glory, then the scriptures have failed, because there are certain scriptures in the Old Testament specifically which talk about the covenants that were made with Israel, the covenant with David, and the covenant with Levi. Those covenants state in Jeremiah that as long as the sun is still standing, as long as the sun is still there, there will always be a man from Levi and a man from David, for Levi to rule as priest, and from David to rule as king. So the son is still here, and that the language that Jeremiah uses is very, very similar to the language the Messiah uses in Gospel of Matthew, where he says, not one small part of the law will be taken away or abolished as long as, I don't know if it says sun, but basically everything on earth, as long as it's still here, this law shall not pass away. These things in this law will still be valid. And because of that, I believe it's necessary for the Levitical priesthood to be restored, because that's the covenant that Yahweh made with Levi. It will never fail until the earth passes away. And the covenant with David, there must be a future king to return. Otherwise, that covenant with David has failed. So I think that we will see a future prophecy or a future fulfillment of the prophecies where there will be a high priest that is not Yeshua. There will be a king, which this could be wrong. But perhaps the Messiah will be the king. But it's very possible that there will be a king who will be restored to the line of David. Or there's some text that may suggest that David himself will reign as king, because there are some passages which talk about a resurrection of some of the dead, like how Revelation speaks of some of the dead are raised, but not all of them. And so of this raising of the dead, apparently David will return, and perhaps some of the other people, like maybe Levi or Aaron will come back. But the other thing to keep in mind is the Qumran people said or believed that in the Pesher method. And the Pesher method seems to have some validity to it, because the scriptures are so inspired. They seem to have a certain knack for multiple fulfillment. But I believe it's important to see what's the primary context, the original historical intention. That should be our primary focus of the interpretation of that passage. However, a secondary interpretation may very well be the Pesher-like method, where you take the prophecy and apply it to allegory and future times.
They're doing that all the time today.
Well, yeah.
Evangelicals, fundamentalists, using the Pesher method. They take a piece of scripture and they apply it to their day.
It doesn't invalidate the method, but it certainly is faulty the way they do it. It's a very false things they do. But I think the Essenes, it's kind of like prophecy, right? The scriptures say that there was valid prophecy. But look at all these people claiming to be prophets, and they're not. They're false prophets, most of them. So just like there's false prophets and true prophets, I would say that there are true interpreters and false interpreters. Pesher means interpretation. So there's the true interpretation and the false interpretation. And who is to be trusted with the true interpretation? Someone inspired like Joseph and Daniel. They were able to see the Pesher of the dreams. I think that word Pesher is actually used in the book of Daniel when Daniel gives the interpretation of the dreams. So the Qumranites, they had, I believe there's good evidence that they were inspired, that they had prophetic abilities. Because of that, their Pesher method can be trusted. Likewise with the apostles, they had inspiration. So their Pesher method could very well be trusted. But people who are not inspired, their Pesher is much less confident. So we only should take it with a grain of salt, those who are not prophets, when they give the interpretation of Scripture.
If you take a look at the Habakkuk Pesher and apply it to the middle of the 1st century AD, then you'll find that the Pesher method is, again, telling us exactly what was happening then with the priesthood, with the Romans, with the Herodians, etc., during the time of Messiah and beyond. It's, of course, you usually need somebody to lead you through these things, because unless you really are familiar with the history, you can't see them. And if that book was written, say, in 100 BC, and you can apply it to 100 AD, then it is a true prophecy. I've been told that, like you said, the main thing we have to look at is the coordination with history. That's the first thing. And Habakkuk Pesher coordinates with history very, very well. If you use players like James the Just, and Paul's in there, and the priest Ananias of the temple, or maybe even Caiaphas, and the armor of the Romans and what the centurions wore, all that stuff is in there. The next question here is a change of pace regarding the moon. What's the purpose of the moon when Yahweh created it? I can start this with a little bit. The purpose of the moon was light the night. That's the main purpose of the moon. The calendar, I believe, that was used, and I think most have come around to this agreement, was not dependent on the moon. You see, in Genesis 1 and beyond, the word moon isn't even in there. What it says is not new moons, it just says new. There's no object of that adjective new. There's nothing there. The word moons is supplied, and it was supplied by the Masoretes which were Pharisees and picked up in our Bibles through their interpretation and their supply of a word that's not there. I will contend, as many do, that what they're talking about being new is not moons at all, but months, new months. And regarding that solar calendar that we're promoting, 364-day calendar, seems to be a perfect calendar. We get the observations from that in Enoch. And Enoch uses the sun continually to say that. In fact, some places in Enoch, it says the moon is to be ignored. But then it also says how the moon coordinates with the sun at the same time. There's a section on the sun. Then later on, there's a little section on the moon, how those, the sun things are going to coordinate with the moon. So to help you be able to also find this calendar with the moon rather than the sun. Now I use the observation calendar for a long time with this little sliver of moon and the observation of barley ears. But see, with that, it's not a perfect calendar. You're going to have to intercalate an extra month every 2-3 years, an extra month, 13th month. This is absolutely not biblical. And we know from history that this calendar in about 1100 AD through Maimonides, the Jewish sage, began to be calculated based on certain observances. And today, the Jewish calendar is a calculated calendar. It's not a natural calendar, certainly not a solar calendar when they use the moon. Yet the early Templars, they most certainly used the sun and probably used that 364-day calendar that I'm talking about, because we have evidence that the books that use it were left out of the canon in order to promote the lunar scheme of calendar, which the Pharisees used and the Sadducees used. So in the time of Yahshua, there were at least 3 calendars and probably 4 calendars going. It depended on what denomination you were in as to which one you use. Now, in Judaism, in the first century, we get the idea that it was all homogeneous. They were all the same. But Josephus talks of at least 4 denominations, and Hippolytus and Epiphanius tell us there were many as 120 different denominations of Judaism. And of course, it doesn't make sense to think that they are all homogeneous when they had all those wars there during that time, and they had all that, the problem with coordinating one with the other. So I would just suggest you try that. But the moon, as I said, doesn't have a central place in the Old Testament, especially in Genesis. It's not even mentioned, except where it says the moon is the light of the night, not the day.
Right. And even in Jubilees too, when you get the creation of the sun, the moon, and the stars, it says they're all created for light, but the sun, it goes into very particular on what its purpose is. The moon is only for a light, spoken of in Genesis and in Jubilees. Also, it refers to it in Jubilees chapter 6 at the end as what would happen when they started following moons.
Yes. Good note.
Jackson, something that's been on my mind for a while. What was that? You were saying earlier that you heard a sound. What did it sound like? Near the beginning of the meeting.
Tell me about it.
You said, "What is that noise?" And then
yeah, I just heard it again.
What is it?
I don't know what it is, but
what does it sound like?
In our Shabbat service, every time Marcel does the hosting there, it sounds like a rattle. It sounds like metal rattling, and that sounded a lot like it right there. You know what it is?
No, I don't. I was just gonna say my computer hums, and then there's a heat duct right here, but that's my only.
This is a loud rattling that I get. I don't know about the rest of you.
I don't hear that, no.
It's not now. It was just at that time. If we hear
Right.
it again, I'll point it out and find out if anybody else hears it but me.
Okay.
Okay.
So I did want to say one other thing about, you brought up the Habakkuk thing,
Yeah.
Pastor. So I'm going through the scriptures right now, the Old Testament, for my version of the Bible. And what I've been doing is I've been using some of the peshers as actual manuscripts of the Bible, like for texts, because they quote each verse in the pesher and then give the interpretation. So you can use the quotes of the verse as a textual variant, if it has any. There have not been many resources yet easily available in English. There's stuff in like Hebrew with like certain footnotes that tell comparisons between the peshers and the Masoretic text, Septuagint, but there's never been a full explanation to the public in English. And so I'm going to actually go through that stuff and compare them and then share with you guys
good
conclusion. So Habakkuk Pesher, I'm going to go through the whole thing, see how it compares with the Masoretic and the Septuagint. I'll note all the differences and then share that with you guys.
There are a lot of variants in there. And if you would do that, that would be a great service, because if you get into some scholarly reading, you see that they've been analyzed and they've been brought out, but not for common readers like us.
Right.
We don't have any knowledge of that whatsoever.
So, and just to be clear, how many years prior to the Masoretic was the Septuagint done?
So the Septuagint was done over a course of a couple centuries. Started in I believe it was the 3rd century BC was when it started.
Right.
And I think it finalized in the 1st century BC, but we don't know the exact date of when it finalized. But it was either 1st century BC or AD. And then the Masoretic text. So just like the Septuagint, like the Septuagint in Origen's time, which is the 3rd century AD, he took the Septuagint and compared it with the Masoretic or the Hebrew of his time, and then sometimes he combined them in the same text. And so later copies of the Septuagint sometimes contain corruptions from the Hebrew text. The original Septuagint didn't have those additions or changes that Origen sometimes made. So the Septuagint has gone through an evolution throughout the years. The earliest copy of the Septuagint that we have complete is 4th century AD. I believe that is Codex Vaticanus. And with the Hebrew, the Masoretic text, the earliest copy we have of the complete is 9th century AD. Mm-hmm. However,
a huge difference in time.
5 centuries later for a complete manuscript. However, there is good evidence, significant evidence, that the Masoretic text already existed essentially the way we have it early, that it existed in the 1st century AD. We don't know when the Masoretic text was created, or the Hebrew of the Masoretic text was created, but it went back at least as early as 1st century AD, because we do have some Masoretic type manuscripts. For example, Masada, we have a copy of the Book of Psalms, almost complete, not quite the whole book, and it is, from what I read, if I remember correctly, every letter exactly matches the Masoretic version of the Psalms. Whereas if you go to the Qumran, the Book of Psalms has so many wild differences and variants. So clearly there was multiple editions that existed in the time of the 1st century AD. So Masoretic, we call it Masoretic because that was altered it was edited together by the Masoretes, but the way they edited it was they simply took the Hebrew text they already had and then they added vowel markings. That's all they did. They didn't really do anything else. They just added vowel markings. But that Hebrew text that they used does go back to 1st century AD. Similarly, the Samaritans, the earliest copy of the Samaritan Torah is comparably only 10th or maybe even around there, 10th century AD, something along the lines. I don't remember the exact century, but certainly not as old as the Septuagint for the earliest full copy. But the Dead Sea Scrolls show that the Hebrew text close to the Samaritan Torah did in fact exist also at those ancient times of the 1st century BC. So clearly all three versions coexisted in the late Second Temple period. So that's important because this whole debate about which version is correct, that existed in the 1st century AD in Yeshua's time. They were debating which version was better because each group already had their preferred version.
Okay.
Hope that answers the question.
Yeah. Did Isaac have concubines? From Diana Crisson.
Not that I'm aware of. I don't think so. Scripture doesn't say anything about it.
Commander Lee did an extensive subject in the Pelagash. And the Pelagash is what we would call a concubine today. It'd be a man would have a wife, then he had some surrogate wives that were like servants, but servants that also served in a sexual fashion. And he says that Isaac did have concubines. But so I don't know. I haven't looked at that personally, but Commander Lee did a little teaching on this at one time. And he said he did. So it's a matter of looking into your scripture and finding out there, Diana.
So I have concluded, based on my study of that word, that it actually means something along the lines of substitute or surrogate, if you will. And the idea is like a replacement. So if you're trying to have a child and your wife can't have a child, someone comes in and takes her place as a substitute, a surrogate. But I have found evidence that regular wives who are not concubines are called pilgash. So I think that, for example, Abraham married 3 times, right? Or he had 3 women. He had Abraham, that was his primary wife. Then he had Hagar as a concubine. According to Jubilees, only after they both died did he then take a 3rd woman, Keturah. Now, there's no reason, from what I can understand of Scripture, you don't have a concubine if you're not married. It doesn't make sense to have a concubine if you're not married. You only have a concubine if you're married. The concubine takes the place of a wife, in my understanding. So it wouldn't make sense for Abraham being single to call the woman he's with, Keturah, his concubine. But if the word means replacement, then she is a replacement. She replaced his earlier wife, Sarah, because she died. So she was replaced by, or substituted by, Keturah. But in the context of a concubine is a substitute, a temporary substitute for the sake of bearing children. Whereas Keturah was a permanent substitute because Sarah died, so he was allowed to take a new wife in her place. So I think that word, what is it, Pelagesh or something? I think it has a broader meaning of replacement or substitute, and that it can refer to actual wives who are replacing former wives who have died. But it can also mean concubines. So I think Isaac, from what I can see, Isaac did not have a concubine, but he may have had a Pelagesh. Although,
so you think that those words are not exactly equal.
Right.
Okay. Sounds good. Here's a question. How old was the Apostle John when he wrote Revelation? You want me to start? I think that's
Yes.
the usual thing. Okay. Here's what I think. If the Bible chronology of Yahshua is correct, assuming that he was crucified in 33, assuming that he might have been 20 years older than that, but assuming that the custom at that time was that when there was a new teacher, he couldn't start teaching until he was 30. And the way he would find students is usually they would come to him, but he was a new teacher. So he went down to Bethabara, to where John was baptizing, and he picked up disciples there, if you remember the story, assuming that's right again. When a child became 17, he had an opportunity to choose in the Israel that day, whether to stay with the career of his father or whoever his guardian was, or he had saved enough money by that time in order to go get himself a teacher and learn how to read and so forth. So that age of 17 was important in Israel for the sons of Israel in the first century. So if he was 17 when he came to Yahshua, or when Yahshua got him, we're talking about not necessarily the writer of the Revelation, but I'm assuming that John the Apostle was the writer of the Revelation. Then John would have been born somewhere right around the year 13. Yahshua would be 13 years older. I know there's no year zero, but just assuming there was, and Yahshua was born that day, John would have been born about 13 years later. So that would make John 57 years old when he wrote Revelation, because John predicts the falling of the temple, or actually, it's not a prediction. He was living at that time that happened. Revelation makes that very clear. Now, a lot of old-time scholars say, and a couple of church fathers say, that John wrote the Revelation in the latter part of the 9th century, 90-something. Or, yeah. But that's pretty much been replaced in this day, because there are a lot of new things that have come into our perspective. If that was the case, then John would have been an advanced old age. They wouldn't have sent him out to a copper mine unless he was able to work in some respect. So he wouldn't have been about 90 years old. People just were feeble at that time, just like they are today. So we predict that he was well into the writing of the Revelation when the temple was destroyed, 57 years of age at that time. Of course, this is all speculation based on what the Gospels say about Yahshua, but I think that that's a lot more reasonable than 90-some years old. An old man working at a copper mine. This didn't happen. They died. They died. They didn't last that long in there. I think I've read before the lifespan of somebody working in a copper mine, and it was like 2 years because they didn't get anything to eat, nourishment, or anything. A lot of pictures show John in a cave on top of the mountain as a very, very old man, writing with pen and ink. That doesn't seem possible to me. He's on the Isle of Patmos. He's in exile. He's been sent there, evidently, by the ruling authorities. And before that, he was the bishop of Ephesus, which is not far from Patmos, right down the road from Patmos. So he couldn't have been 90-some years old, or he couldn't have been writing in the time of Domitian. as a couple of the church fathers say. The church fathers say a lot of things that aren't true. A lot of things. They didn't know any better than we do. In fact, we probably know better now than a church father that lived 400 years after Messiah. So that's what I think. 57 years old, and sounds right to me, sounds reasonable. And I know the thing about the 17 years for children is true. That question came from Matthew Oakley. You have anything to add?
I think, that very much is based on when the apocalypse itself was written, and that scholars debate on that. And then, of course, we don't really know when John was born or when he died.
No, we don't.
So it's very unclear his exact age. But according to Josephus, the Essenes lived, many of the Essenes lived over 100 years old. So I definitely think he could have lived to an advanced age. But we just don't know.
I mean, it could, but look, the only thing on Patmos, which is 49 square miles, a little island, were copper mines that were being mined by the Romans. There were not people that lived there at that time. They were just people sent there to get the copper out put in slave labor until they died. Now, I would hope there are apocryphal writings that tell us that John did get out of there, and one says he was boiled in oil, and there are different stories about how he died, but I don't think he died a martyr. I think he, according to the prophecy of Yeshua, that he lived to old age, and that, who knows, he might be alive today. If you remember the end of the Gospel of John, who knows, he might be alive.
Well, there's some apocrypha which may suggest that.
Mm-hmm. So was King Solomon a real person, and did he really exist? You want me to start?
Sure.
I'm just picking these by random here. King Solomon, he's attested to in the Bible, and a lot of minimalists today, Bible scholars, say that history is all a bunch of lies. I don't believe it's a bunch of lies. I think, of course, it's a narrative story that has been crafted. If you look at the dedication of Solomon's temple in Kings, and you look at it in Chronicles and compare those, you'll find that those two stories are as different as night and day, though they both go along with a certain chronology there. What happens is very much different. The attitudes are so much different. There is another testament of Solomon from Ethiopia. It's called the Kibra Nagash. And I would suggest that you can get this online. I think it's in the general reading material, Kibra Nagash, or you can buy it used from a dealer like Amazon. And it tells the story also of the queen of Abyssinia, the queen of Sheba, and her son Menelik. And of course, the son was one of the sons of Solomon. He was the only son left of Solomon. That there was a Rehoboam, but Rehoboam was not the one that Solomon picked to take over the kingdom. Menelik was this one he picked. And he brought Menelik and his mother to Jerusalem to look through the temple, to learn the statutes of Yahweh. And he wanted them to stay and wanted Menelik to take over instead of Rehoboam. But Menelik said, no, I've got to go home to my people. She was the queen, but there was no king. He was the king of Abyssinia. So he took his knowledge and went back home. The Kibra Nagash also tells a quite shocking story about Solomon. That is, when the Queen of Sheba came for the first time to seek the wisdom of Solomon, she got something besides the wisdom of Solomon. The story goes that Solomon gave her a choice. You can either consent to my raping you, or you don't need to consent. I'm going to do it either way. If you consent to it, then you won't be hurt. If you don't consent to it, I am going to violently rape you despite what you try to do. The text here follows the history of the queen and Menelik the son. And the decision that the queen made was to go along with it rather than expect a violent rape. And she became pregnant with Menelik, but he didn't appear until she got back to Abyssinia. Then when he becomes 17 to 20, they both came back to Jerusalem to see Solomon. Solomon had requested that they come because of the reason I already told you. And it's that book, which I have here, is very interesting. And it seems to recollect a history from an Ethiopian point of view. And I'm wondering if that isn't in the Ethiopian canon right now. I'm not remembering that it was, but it could well be, because it's still a hallowed book by the Ethiopians. They still read it as part of their catechism in their church. And so if you would read it, I think you would think it's pretty realistic. So those are some issues regarding the Queen and Solomon that just nobody knows about, but it's so realistic as it's told, I believe it. In fact, they said that Menelik looked so much like Solomon, except he was a man of color, that before he got to Jerusalem, he toured Israel with his mother, and everybody thought he was the young Solomon. He looked so much like him. And when they got together, they looked like doubles, with the obvious difference of the age. Does that answer that question? Was he a real person? I should have just said yes. What do you think?
I think there's a tendency amongst skeptics to believe that no one exists until proven otherwise.
Yeah, minimalist. They don't believe anybody exists.
You know, they believe Yeshua never existed. If you go with that approach, a lot of people, Socrates, maybe Socrates didn't exist.
Right.
And a bunch of people that we don't really have proof necessarily, external proof. A lot of these proofs that we have are in some sense circular, like scripture is circular, but I believe in the default point of view that if a text is making a claim, that author is sincere and not knowingly deceiving and saying lies. So if someone wrote about a person named Solomon, whoever wrote that had to have believed that that was true. It doesn't mean it is true, but they had to believe it was true. So why would someone believe that a story about Solomon was true? The evidence best indicates that people tend to believe things if there's some credibility to it. Not necessarily the entire thing. Sometimes, a bunch of stuff can be put together and some of it contains falsehood, but people accept things because it resembles truth. So they're not going to just invent these random historical characters that have no basis in historical reality. There's got to be some historical basis to these figures, whether it's full historical accuracy or only partial. there's got to be someone behind the basis to these stories. And the farther you go back in time, the more likely that there may have been some alterations over time to the story, like Adam and Enoch. You know, what was the first language of creation? Was it Hebrew or a Semitic language? If it was not a Semitic language, then that it has to be a Semitic language. And what I mean is, if their names are what Scripture says they are, it has to be a Semitic language. However, if it was not a Semitic language, that was the language of creation, that means Adam was not actually named Adam. Eve was not named Eve. Enoch was not named Enoch. All these characters before the flood. Noah was not named Noah. And that very well could be. Those are possibilities that are to be considered. Jubilees claims that Hebrew is the language of creation. I believe that is, but that original Hebrew is very different than what we call Hebrew. But if that's the case, Hebrew was the original language of creation in some form, then those names would be authentic. But it doesn't matter whether it is or not, because, in other words, if Hebrew is not the language of creation, it doesn't make the story less false simply because some of the things were changed over time due to translation. It would be a translation. So Enoch wasn't his actual name, perhaps. Maybe it was something else. And maybe they used different language. Who knows, right? But Enoch being called by a different name originally wouldn't detract from the main accuracy of the story. It could be true story with some of the wording and details slightly changed over time. So with Solomon, I have no doubt in my mind that Solomon was a historical figure. Whether some of the events happen or not, that's more debatable. Like, for example, the story of the demons helping him build a temple. I have high doubts that Solomon was commanding visible ghosts or invisible ghosts to build the temple. That is a hard thing for me to fathom. But I could certainly believe that people who were demon possessed were building the temple. And it was that way that he communicated with the demons and built the temple through demon-possessed people. So that could be one way of making a seemingly absurd story, or, like I said, seemingly absurd, to more credibility. So other things of Solomon may be exaggerations. Like, for example, was Solomon really the wisest man in the world? That may very well be an exaggeration by Israel, because they valued his wisdom so much, they wanted to make him look like the most amazing, wise person ever. But he may not have been the most amazing, wise person ever, especially when we look at some of his actions, right? So there's certain details in Scripture which we may question, perhaps, are they valid or often accurate depiction? But in the main historical nucleus of Solomon's story, I think we must maintain is true. I mean, if they were creating this story about Solomon, why would they create a story where Solomon is the bad guy? It didn't make sense, right? The same thing with David. Why would they create a story about David where David is this horrible murderer and adulterer, even though he's supposed to be a man after Yahweh's heart who keeps the Torah, and yet he has such a horrible moral fall, and because of his sin, his concubines are raped and wars are started. His kids become evil people. So it wouldn't make sense for people to make up these horrible stories about their heroes. Chronicles omits the bad stories. Jackson was talking earlier about the distinction between Chronicles and Kings, those books. And Kings presents a very critical picture of many of the kings. included in Kings is the books of Samuel, because in the Septuagint, 1st and 2nd Samuel are called 1st and 2nd Kingdoms, and 1st and 2nd Kings are called 3rd and 4th Kingdoms. So they're considered a series, those 4 books. 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings together. So in Samuel, David sins horribly, and in Kings, Solomon sins horribly. But in Chronicles, David's sin is taken away. You don't hear it. Solomon's sin, ignored, not there. So if someone was going to write a fiction account of their nation heroes, you would expect something like Chronicles. You would not expect something like Samuel and Kings, where they create literal horrible role models. It wouldn't make sense. So I think that's probably the best defense you can have, with short of actual archaeological proof with artifacts that show Solomon have corroborating evidence. The best we can go with is these documents are best explained by the supposition that Solomon was a historical figure and that these stories are based primarily on truth. That's my take. Let's see here. Okay, well, Eve is literally the same as Hua. So we say Eve, but the better pronunciation is Eva or Ewa. Because, depending how you pronounce the name, for example, if you look in the King James version, you have Jeremy, but the Hebrew, of course, is Jeremiah, or it wouldn't be J, it'd be Jeremiah, or it would be Jeremiah. So the King James shortens it, removes a syllable, and just says Jeremy. And so similarly with Eve, we call it Eve because that's how we're used to saying it, because of our English dialect. But like I said, originally it was Eva, but spelled Eve, but it was Eva, or V and W were very closely related letter sounds, so Ewa. So it is essentially the same as Hawa. A little different, but it's the basic thing of, is it Yeshua? Is it Yahushua? There's different pronunciations. It's the same thing with Eva and Hava. They're different Semitic pronunciations. But like I said, us English people, we have bastardized the pronunciations. So now we just say Eve, just like we say Jesus, like Jesus. That sounds very stupid. Jesus. When originally it was Yesa, or Yesu, or Yesu, and then it comes from Yeshu. And then, of course, in the Greek, it was Yesos. So Yeshuaus, so it's very much a historical continuity. But of course, like I said, when it winds up in English, we butcher it and just say Jesus. And likewise, the same is happened with Eve. And yeah, so Yeshu is a acronym that the Jews came up with to mean may his name be blotted out. But you could like there's different dialects. So I'm sure Yeshu could be a valid pronunciation, depending, because it's an ayin, and the ayin is basically an O sound or an ah, and it could, perhaps have a sound. So it could be Yesha, but instead of with the H, it would just be spelled with a U, Yesha. So anyway, pretty much at the end, but I did want to say the moon, it was asked about the moon, and according to Slavonic Third Baruch, we read, it says, I, Baruch, said to the angel, concerning this I wish to ask thee, why the moon has not the same light as the sun? And the angel said to me, listen, Baruch, and I will tell thee. Thou shalt know all, and thou shalt know it. When the serpent deceived Adam and Eve and made appear their nakedness, and they wept bitterly about their nakedness, and the whole creation wept about them, the heavens, the sun, and the stars, and creation was shaken to the throne of God. The angels and the powers were stirred concerning the sin of Adam. But the moon laughed. On this account, God was angry with her and darkened her light and caused her in a short time to grow old and to be born again. But at first she was not so, but was brighter than the sun and had the length of day. So there you have it. It was the moon. The moon is the way it is because it laughed when it was not supposed to laugh. That's the Slavonic Third Baruch.
That naughty old moon.
The Greek version of Third Baruch doesn't say that, by the way, but perhaps there's some small authenticity to parts of this, basically saying it is possible that the moon originally did not change the way it does, and then maybe from some unknown reason, perhaps after the fall, it started, with the fall, when the fall happened, nature changed, right? So maybe Yah decided to make the moon have its cycle after the fall of Adam for some random reason. I don't know why, but.
You understand French? Lavash Kiri. It was the cow that laughed on the moon. Lavash Kiri. A type of cheese.
Emerson was asking if maybe when it says the moon laughed, perhaps it was the moon god or the moon El, because the watcher appointed over the moon was also called the moon as it's part of its name. Sure. It was called would it be like what would it be, Yarael or something? I'm not sure exactly, but that's a possibility. Maybe he laughed. Although it would seem strange to punish the moon for the sins of the watcher appointed over the moon. That would seem unfair. So I would go more towards the view that the moon itself is the intent of the passage. But of course, the moon laughing seems kind of silly. There is a life of Adam and Eve says the moon and sun prayed for Adam and Eve when the fall happened. The scriptures do speak of the sun and moon being living entities, but I'm not sure how they could be aware of what's happening on the earth. So I would think that probably a little bit suspicious there. So maybe in life of Adam and Eve, for the sun and moon, it's the watchers in that scenario. But anyways, so it's 10:34, so I guess we will end it here. I know last time we did an after study, but I'm not really inclined to it this time because last time we stayed up super late.
I bet.
And this week's been a little crazy for me, so I'm just gonna relax. But I enjoyed the discussion today, guys.
Thank you for your erudition. It's very much appreciated. Now, see you all later. Thank you for coming.
Shabbat shalom.